Welcome to the Day in History for April 17th. We are going way back in time today. We're going to 1397. Today is the day that Geoffrey Chaucer tells the Canterbury Tales for the first time at the court of Richard II. Now, the big idea for today is that stories often remain the same. Even though this story, the stories that are told in this popular, very well-researched story, even though these are old stories, they are very similar to the stories that we see today in movies, books, all over the place. Pretty interesting. So, I'm going to let you write this down. Okay, here we go. We are in London again, and we are at the Shrine of Canterbury. It's a big, huge church, and I'll show you a picture of that later. Okay. Now, what we're going to talk about today is a book, okay? It's really just a book, but it was a book that was written a long time ago. Now, this book, called the Canterbury Tales, is actually a collection of short stories, or a collection of stories that are being told. And we'll talk more about what the stories are actually are in a minute. So, let's move on. Now, we need to talk about Geoffrey Chaucer. Geoffrey Chaucer was born around, I think, like 1340, something like that. We don't know for sure. The farther back in time we go, the less accurate our birthdays tend to be. So, Geoffrey was born in London. Now, London looked a lot different in 1340, but, I mean, we've talked about London multiple times and multiple days in history. We even talked about the beginning of the year with the Romans, and I showed you that picture. This is kind of similar to the picture I showed you then, except this is a map of London in like 1500. I couldn't find one from 1400, so I got as close as I could. Now, Geoffrey Chaucer had a job to help the king. Now, his job was to be a royal page or a royal emissary. And pretty much what that means is you're like an assistant to the royalty, the king and queen. And an emissary is somebody that goes to other countries and like delivers messages from the royalty or from the king. And so what this meant was that Geoffrey Chaucer traveled all over Europe. And as he traveled, he met tons of different people. He learned different languages, and he absorbed a lot of the customs and the culture and how people acted in different countries. And on top of that, he met people from all different walks of life. People that were nobility and people that were peasants, and he talked to them all. And many scholars, many historians believe that this is where he gets some of the stories and the ideas for the stories that he tells in the Canterbury Tales. Pretty interesting guy, he traveled a lot. Now, before we move on, we need to talk about what life was like in the year 1350, 1360, 1400, because it looked a lot different than it does today, obviously. And so we're going to talk a little bit about the class system. So the picture I have here is meant to represent the peasant class, or the class that wasn't noble or royal. And this would include peasants, serfs, merchants, monks, friars, all of these people that made up the vast majority of the population. Okay, these were the normal people, and life was a lot different back then. Men and women were not treated equal at all. Women had very little power. And there's a lot that you can study about this time period and how the different classes interacted, but men pretty much had all the power. Now, this group of people, they did most of the work in this society. And, well, that's why they were called the peasants. So let's move on to the next group. Now, this is the royalty and the nobility. These are the people that had the power, the kings, the queens, the barons, the dukes, the people that were born into a rich family and inherited rich estates or rich like land, and so they had a bit more power. Now, Geoffrey Chaucer, interestingly enough, had to work with both classes. And so he was like a person that could kind of go in between the classes, which gave him a really interesting perspective, or a really interesting point of view when it came to these different class systems or different groups of people. Now, Geoffrey Chaucer wrote this in Middle English, and one of the reasons that this is a day in history, and one of the reasons that if I say the Canterbury Tales, many people recognize it, is that it's one of the very first books, fiction books, written in English. Even though it is Middle English, and it looks much different, it was written in English. A lot of things before this time period were written in Latin. There was actually kind of an argument going on in Europe at the time, because the Bible, I mean, religion and Christianity was huge in this time period. I mean, it's still huge today, but it was central to the way of life. Most of the Bibles were written in Latin, but then they translated it to English so that other people, so that normal peasants could read it. And there was a big argument about that. But Geoffrey Chaucer wrote this in Middle English. Now, Middle English is not like English today. I'm actually going to read you some. You want to hear me speak Middle English? I have no idea what I'm going to say. I might be able to translate it, but it's going to sound pretty weird. I'm going to do my best. Here we go. Ready? Okay. So, I actually put the wrong slide in there. I'm sorry. I'm going to read Middle English to you in a second. But first, I want to tell you about the books. Okay? Now, the reason I put the book picture here is because before this, there wasn't a culture of reading. People didn't read. They didn't have books. Books were really hard to get. And so Geoffrey Chaucer, by writing this book in English, the language that people were speaking, kind of started the culture of reading. So let's move on. I was super excited to read Middle English. That's why I skipped my slide. You ready? Here we go. Okay, ready? Now, when thy were both a fought light, Sir Amlun, that hendy knight, was right wise man of rede, and said to Sir Amos full right, Brother, are we as twined plight? Brother, the word indeed, for this day forward, newer mo to folly other, for well-winged woe, to help him at his need. Brother, now, 'twere to me, and ye satchel been as 'twere the, alas, so God me sped. Did you understand that? You might have understood a little bit. There were a few things. Let's look at this. A man of reed. I'm going to suspect a man of red, maybe? Brother, as 'twere the plight. So, brother and the plight. How about to help him at his need? That sounds like English, right? If I said to help him at his need, you know what I would mean. It's spelled differently. But some of it we can understand, but most of it, it's like a different language. Well, it is. Okay. Now, let's talk about the story. So it's called the Canterbury Tales because a group of people are going here to the Shrine of Canterbury to pray. It's kind of like a pilgrimage. It's like a religious walk to show how devout or how much you believe in your religion. Now, the characters, there's a ton of characters. And this is a really famous picture of the different characters. The bottom one is the whole picture, and then I zoomed in on the top. Now, what's interesting is that Geoffrey Chaucer takes all these different people from different classes. Remember we talked about peasants and merchants and monks and priests and all of them? Well, he takes them all and he puts them in this pilgrimage, which is partially based on reality or a real story, but it's also made up by Chaucer. Now, there are like 24 different characters, and obviously you can't read all these, but there are a ton of different characters, and each of them has a story to tell. Each has a story. Yes, there's a lot of stories inside a story. This is actually a frame story. I think we talked about this a little in class. Remember, if you've seen The Princess Bride, or The Never-Ending Story? Yep. Two really popular, at least from my childhood, and that you guys have probably seen. But in both of those stories, there's someone reading a book, or in reality, but then the movie's also about something that's happening in the book or in like the fantasy world. And so there's actually two stories taking place. That's what we call it a frame story. It's like a picture frame, right? A picture hangs on a wall. It has a frame, and then there's something happening in the picture. So, okay, so this is a frame story. Now, it follows a very, very common story arc. This is one of the most common story arcs that you will see. You have the story start out, there's some action that is leading up to something happening, there's the big climax, this is what happens, and then the action falls down, and then the story ends. Most of the tales in the Canterbury Tales are about or follow this arc. It's a little bit different than some of the arcs that we've talked about, like the hero arc or boy meets girl or man in a hole or something like that. This is just your straight introduction, something's starting to happen, it happens, and then the story ends. Very common. To be honest, if you're struggling with your nano, this is a really good story arc to follow. So, now, the story takes place at an inn. Now, an inn is like a hotel and a bar put together. And all these people are around this table. Or not this, well, maybe it's a table. I don't know. This is the picture I found. But pretty much, they decide to have a storytelling contest. And so they all start telling stories. And the Canterbury Tales are the stories themselves. And each character will go through and tell a story. Now, some of these stories are really inappropriate. Like, I can't even fully explain to you what they're all about, but they have to do with some human growth and development stuff that we missed, and they're really like funny in like that inappropriate sort of humor. For example, there is a scene or in one of the stories where somebody sticks their butt out a window and farts in somebody's face. These are meant to be funny, entertaining stories. And if you look at many of the stories that you tell with your friends, a lot of times they deal with things that are funny. They're like, seriously, there's fart jokes in these stories. I don't know, they're pretty funny. And there's a lot of them. I believe there's 17,000 separate lines that Geoffrey Chaucer wrote about this. So you can see why people would really like these stories. Now, before Geoffrey Chaucer, if you heard a story, it was like this. It was like me telling you a story. It was called oral storytelling. And for the vast majority of human history, all stories were told by word of mouth. It wasn't until about this time that people started writing stories down so that you could go back and read them. And the stories that people wrote were entertaining. We want to be entertained. Are you not entertained? I'm entertained. That's why I read every single night, and that's why you should read every night too. So, very interesting stories. Now, the Canterbury Tales has gone down in history as a very important piece of literature that helped influence other writers, because people after Geoffrey Chaucer, when they decided to write a book, they were often inspired by his stories. And so they used some of his techniques and tools to write their stories. Now, the Canterbury Tales is a very common book. I learned about it in my English class when I got a degree in literature. I had to go through a bunch of the Canterbury Tales. It is very popular, and now you know about one of the oldest fiction books in the English language. Thanks, guys.